And the floor goes to our second speaker for today, Oleg Khlevniuk, at the International Center for the History and Sociology of World War II, High School of Economics, Moscow. The theme of his presentation, Who and How Much Victims of Stalinism in Academic Historiography and Historical Imagination in Contemporary Russia. The floor is yours, Oleg. Oleg, thank you. Let me remind you that in different historical periods in Russia, there were different historical examples of extreme state violence. In the 20th and the 21st century, this place is firmly and rightfully occupied by the dictatorship of Stalin. In state ideology, mass perceptions, and scientific historiography, the phenomenon of extreme state violence plays a critical role. For mass political perceptions, this is the most understandable example either to follow or to deny. This is a way to criticize the modern state, a kind of participation in the current political processes. Interest towards these phenomena from the historians is explained by the fact that the level of state violence most clearly characterizes one system or another. If we're to talk about the Stalin period, it's clear that none of the events or phenomena can be understood without taking into account the factor of terror. Given different motivations and mass perceptions and studies of Stalinism, they usually follow parallel courses, rarely intersecting. Let me remind you some of the mass historical myths that have been circulating, despite the fact that there is historical evidence to defy the myths. For instance, it was the bosses that were repressed and they got what they deserved for thievery and corruption. Arrests followed denunciations that Encarada had to respond to. Stalin had nothing to do to organizing terror. Everything was done against his will by local heads and authorities. This list can go on. But today I will talk about an issue which is not only mythologized in mass perceptions, but is also not comprehended enough historiographically. Paradoxically enough, we're going to talk about a question, the answer to which should precede any research of Stalinist state violence. How many victims there were and who should be considered to be victims of Stalinism. Despite a huge number of different publications about Stalinism, the Gulag, and historiography, there is no comprehensive research on the statistics or on the system of state violence overall. What we need to begin with is the fact that state violence over the course of this period, despite the fact it was targeting certain social groups, it was very dispersed and could potentially affect anyone. People were shot, sent to camps, there were mass deportations, and within the system, they only contributed the tip of the iceberg. Millions of people were arrested with no sentences. People were convicted but not imprisoned. People were subjected to severe discrimination on the basis of collective responsibility. The quantitative assessment of each of these categories is very hard to do. The key difficulty, the key challenge here is the imperfection of official stats, the double count of convicts, etc. As a result, this sort of estimates are lacking in our research. Omitting numerous methodological details, I shall present the results of my research and my calculations. They can serve as a starting point for developing generally accepted parameters that are lacking. These indicators would cover the so-called net number of people repressed in each of the categories with no double counts. So, in 1930 to 1952, there were about 1 million people that were shot, plus an unknown number of people that were shot with no sentences, no judgment. About 70 million prisoners went through camps, colonies, and prisons. About 6 million people were deported. About 2 million people were sent to prisons following an arrest with no formal convictions, so they never went to trial. About 23 million people were sentenced without being imprisoned, received sentences other than imprisonment. So merging these indicators into a single whole remains an important task. We need to avoid double counting, although it's not quite yet clear how that can be done. But overall, we are convinced that we can talk about tens of millions of Soviet citizens that in one way or another experienced some kind of punishment during the Stalinist period. Alongside quantifying terror and state violence, a critical role is played by qualitative assessments. The separation of political and non-political convicts would be critical. Within the existing tradition, there is a very rigid boundary between them. As a general rule, the victims of political repression include those that were condemned by the infamous Article 58. All of the others are often considered common criminals that exist in any state. The number of political convicts is presented on this slide. There are about 4 million convicts for political reasons, according to the criteria of official statistics, mainly under Article 58. About 4 million in 1930-1952. It is customary to add, and this is the right way to proceed, the 6 million that were deported, that were undoubtedly persecuted for political reasons. An open question remains about how we should qualify those that were formally non-politically repressed. Were they criminals? Were they convicts? It's a complex issue that requires extensive, in-depth research. I would like to share some preliminary observations. First of all, I have to note that some of those that were convicted under ordinary articles were in fact political convicts and prisoners. For example, the so-called Gulags, at a certain period, they were sent to camps under the article for speculation, although the actual motive, and nobody would hide the fact, were political cleansing of the villages. These categories of convicts require further systematization. Moving on, it's necessary to focus on some generic indicators of the structure of court sentences passed during the Stalinist period. As you can see in this table, that for typical criminal offenses, such as murder, hooliganism, robberies, etc., a small proportion of court sentences would be passed. You can see on the slide, these are decimals of percentages, or a few percent. What's drawing our attention to is the huge number of sentences that were passed under mass campaigns that had to do with the criminalization of the socioeconomic relations in the country. About 16 million people were convicted just for violations of labor discipline or unauthorized dismissal from work. This is data for 1940 to 1956, so when these decrees prevailed. These kind of criminal sanctions were very specific to the Stalinist legal system. It criminalized those spheres of socioeconomic relations that are not generally criminalized or are not criminalized as harshly in more moderate systems, including the USSR before and after Stalin. Would it be correct to classify these millions of convicted persons as criminals? To answer these questions, while there's usually objections that are raised, each era must be judged by its laws, taken into account the specific historical context. Accepting this objection, let's turn to real, actual practices of the way legislation under Stalin was implemented, the extreme cases. First of all, we need to find out whether extreme legislation was perceived as justified by the contemporaries themselves, primarily by professionals and those that were part of the judicial and the prosecutional system. We don't have enough time now to go into detail, but I'll focus on some of the typical examples concerning the decree from 1947 on the embezzlement of state property, which was typical for criminalization during the times. On the slide, you can see an address from the prosecution and justice to Stalin in April 1951. They were offering to review the rules of the law on theft and embezzlement, the law from 1947, pointing out its excessive brutality and the fact that it was unjustified. They wrote that the 7-year sentence, and that was the minimum sanction under the decree, were given to people that committed minor violation, and they were pushed to those due to difficult living conditions. For example, they were talking about an invalid of war who was condemned for 7 years for stealing a loaf of bread from the bakery he was working in, or a mother of a minor child who lost her husband during the war, and she received 7 years for stealing a kilogram of rice. This kind of professional rejection were partially raised by this awareness, this rejection of these draconian laws. Again, I have to limit myself, unfortunately, to just one example. A letter from a student, a pupil of a rural school, to Stalin. This letter was, in fact, handed over to Stalin. It reached him, but as other similar appeals, it did not arouse his interest. The letter read, as you can see on the slide, it talks about 2 collective farmers that were being tried for stealing grain, bread. They also wrote, well, it's not because they were well off that they had to steal. Perhaps there were children hungry during the winter. If they had a better way of life, perhaps it would have been legitimate to give them 10 years for stealing grain. They were forced to steal, and that's not fair. You need to create tolerable life conditions, and then you can judge people. So these examples, and there is a multitude of these examples, you can definitely give many more, indicate the fact that contemporaries, including professional lawyers, estimated these extreme decrees that were used to convict millions of people as unjust and excessive. And there's no reason why we should treat them differently today. It's obvious that within the Stalinist system of state violence, a lot of people found themselves behind bars. The severity of their punishment did not correspond to the danger of the crime. So the misdemeanors, and a significant proportion of those that were convicted were ordinary Soviet citizens who violated these excessively harsh laws due to difficult living conditions, or because they were victims to various demonstrative campaigns to restore order in the state. These convicts cannot be considered to be purely criminals. Among them, there were so-called pure political convicts, and the line between them is very blurry. ultimately speaking, both of these categories were victims of criminal state violence. The facts that I've listed and the observations that I've shared indicate the fact that the problems of state violence, the historical aspects, require further research. Even in relation to such a well-known phenomenon as Stalinism. This would also apply. This kind of research will help us to better understand the essence and the mechanism of the development of dictatorships and tyrannies, and that's why I think it's important to get to the most accurate quantitative assessment and qualitative characteristics of the Soviet experience of state violence. Thank you. Thank you so much. Irina, thank you. Great. So we have some questions. I'm not sure. First, I will ask the participants of the conference. Does anybody want to ask any questions? Perhaps our colleagues? Well, no, not yet. Okay, so before I read the question that I consider to be very important, well, it's not so much a question, it's a comment that I wanted to share. I think you raised a very important topic. Talking about this other norm that we need to use to judge a different era, but you were convincing in saying that people did understand that this norm was violated even back then, even after the Civil War, after the First World War. Definitely, the population was very militarized. There was a lot of aggression. Nonetheless, this was perceived still as excessive. But then the problem is, in the historical material itself, a lot of people that would insist that that was the norm back then, in one way or another, what they used to judge the era is they use the official product, the successive official material that could create the illusion that people would accept this norm. So my question is, clearly, some of the facts keep coming up, but there were materials that testify the opposite, and they are much fewer. And here's a question of historical knowledge. If you're lacking arguments, so what do you do about this? So what do you do with facts that were concealed? Of course, there were diaries. Of course, people would try to keep a private diary, but this is private memories. This is a different sphere. How can it counter this excessive official propaganda? And what do we do with that? Oleg, well, there are two aspects that we could consider here. One, you mentioned this attempt to reconstruct mass perception, mass attitudes towards various historic acts, Stalinist acts, etc. And another important aspect here is a more attentive way of working with the documents from the authorities that would implement all of these rules. In fact, they did understand and even talked about the fact that they were aware that these laws were unjust and that they were excessive and they had to be corrected, they had to be amended. And as soon as there was as soon as Stalin died, they did do it. So the repressive authorities themselves realized that was too much, right? Like, yes, precisely. That's way too much. Come on, guys. But nobody could do it. So in my opinion, I think it's an important argument to promote our understanding and research of the Stalin criminal, non-political judicial system. So these are the terms I think about this, and this is the way I conceptualize this. Perhaps there'll be other way. At least this is the questions that we should be asking ourselves. We're too harsh in terms of distributing, breaking down everybody into various groups, compartmentalizing political, non-political, etc. The non-political were just criminals, and these are like non-criminals. Criminals, this is a very vague understanding. Criminals are murderers, criminals are thieves, but there are other categories, intermediary categories. In the camps, they were called like everyday criminals. These things need to be taken into account. Otherwise, we'll never be able to understand what Stalinist violence was about, state violence. Irina, I think that this breakdown leads to this trauma. If we were to quantify everything, it would be such an astonishingly huge number. That's why people are trying to, like, we're talking about reducing these numbers. They're saying, like, that's not true. There were some that were justly convicted. Let's keep the numbers low. What I'm astonished by in the current idealization of the period, people normalize terror, in fact. It's important for people often to prove that people were justly convicted, but they never ask themselves the question of the fact that Gulag itself was not a legal establishment. Even if people were justly sent they should have been sent to prison, strictly speaking, not a Gulag. That was way beyond. In our culture, it's just so in depth. It's so ingrained in our culture. People don't even ask themselves the question that this whole system, this lack of fair justice, that the gulags should not exist in a civilized society. People don't even ask themselves these questions. They don't even question it. So our legal awareness is lagging behind, even in this respect, not even talking about the number of people that were sent to prisons. Oleg, that's an important question, of course. Not the Gulag itself, perhaps, so the formal Gulag that was legitimized by various laws, but the actual Gulag, which was not a place of punishment. It would often turn into a place of destruction. And people were not condemned to destruction. They were condemned to imprisonment. And in this state, the state was being not legitimate in its violence. Irina, we have a question from Alexandra Lusov. Could Stalinist terror be perceived in the aspects of privatizing Trotsky's ideas on preventive violence? Well, strictly speaking, preventive violence is not Trotsky's idea. It's not his concept, as we heard in the previous presentation. It's an idea that goes back to the French Revolution. It's the concept behind the First World War. And the authorities of the time would widely rely on preventive violence and purges of various entire regions. The first concentration camps that appeared during the Boer Wars. You're setting the question correctly. It's definitely the right question to ask. We should be exploring these concepts of preventive violences and purges. If we take the most well-known phenomenon as 1937, 1938, for instance, that's a very illustrative example of how preventive purges would occur. These are imaginary, not real fifth column at that point. And that's when the term was coined, in fact, already 1937, 1938. That's we're in the midst of the war in Spain, and that's where the term is coined. And people start using it. And in all of the documents, in the Czechist discussions among themselves and the instructions that they would receive, there is this constant coming back to this idea that we're getting ready for war. And that's why we need to eliminate millions of enemies, potential enemies, to make sure that in the event of the war, they don't harm us. This idea is very clearly read in all of the documents during the Great Terror. But not only that, even in the post-war period, this is something that's very apparent. You could say that they were getting ready for a new war, the Third World War, but the logic is similar. The logic is very consistent, and it's a very great observation to make. You're absolutely right. Irina, another question that I had, the figures, the stats that you've been sharing, do they include the results of collectivization? Alongside people that were exiled, people that died of hunger, this is a huge army of people, right? I don't think anybody ever quantified and counted them. Is that even possible? Like, well, strictly speaking, if we talk about criminals that were persecuted in the villages themselves by the villages, well, that's not included into the stats. But what the stats do include, collectivization is, on the one hand, setting up collective farms, this whole mass engagement, forceful engagement of peasants into the process. On the other hand, we're talking about mass punitive measures that were guided by the same principles of threatening people, this preventive purges, clear out everybody who can potentially resist the collective farm system. And this campaign and the violent element would consist, on the one hand, of mass arrests, people being sent to camps and people being shot, and this is included in the stats that I shared. On the other hand, we need to factor in those that were deported, 6 million people. 2 million people of those deported were kulaks and their families. What we did not factor into these stats were these people that decided to step away from being kulaks themselves, people that were wary, that were afraid of potential arrests or of being exiled, and they left their farms, they left their houses, and they escaped. They escaped from the villages just to save themselves and their families. This was definitely a challenge. And I think that a part of these people, well, it's not that I think, I'm absolutely sure, there's just no documents to prove it, but that must have been the case. Sooner or later, of course, they were caught by the system and they were traced by NKVD, and they would be exiled either way, or shot even, or subjected to other forms of discrimination. But it's this category of people that chose themselves to leave their kulak lifestyle. But in fact, they were also victims to collectivization. They were not included in these stats that I shared. And I think this is the right approach. When we talk about the system of violence overall, and this is what I tried to do in the first part of my presentation, you need to understand that it's not focused on like a few bullet points. That's not how it works. Like, some people were arrested and that some were exiled, and others people were arrested and shot. It just penetrated the entire society, and it would come in very different forms. People could be exiled, people could be rid of their rights to get bread. They were not given the food cards. They could be fired from their work. People could be moved from the cities, the towns that they lived in, the houses. And if you try to sort of think that this applies to you, well, that's not a big deal. You might think, okay, you were forced to move from a different city, you had to go and move elsewhere. Maybe that's the way to see it. But if you just think about that this could be possible as applied to you, and like tomorrow people would come after you and say, you've got 3 hours, pack all your stuff, and we have to move you wherever like we think you should be, with no housing there waiting for you, no work, nobody cared about any of that. Then you can just begin to imagine the level of terror, if you will, that people would feel in a similar situation. Irina, well, we have another question from Oleg Khlevniuk. Would this be a development of Sakharov's ideas about prisoners whose legal status is nivelated when norms are lost and the entire society is traumatized? Oleg, well, yes, I do think that well, this is something that we embarked on already in our discussion. The system, the punitive system itself it should be legal, it should be legitimate. Even if it's very cruel, it has to be guided by certain norms of law. And when we start talking about a system that turns rather than a system that delivers punishment into a system that administers additional punishment, additionally traumatizing the convicts, the victims, then of course that's exactly what we would be talking about. People would die in millions in the gulags of hunger, malnutrition, or there would be a lot of mortality because of backbreaking labor that they were forced to perform, or various types of delays. They would be kept in Gulag beyond the time, the sentence that were given. And there were other means, other ways of adding to the punishment. And this serves as an additional factor that would intensify the state violence that we're talking about. Thank you so much. Of course, this is a huge topic, and it's always relevant. I'm not going to be asking any further questions. What I think is important to focus on here as well, roughly speaking, these are official norms, the institutions, and everything that's beyond the legal practices. Going back to the 1960s, when we got back to the Lenin norms of law, that was a way to at least get in the system back to some kind of social totalitarian, but still a legal norm. And what I think is important here, and this requires further research and further enlightenment. I know that in mass perceptions, people don't understand how the labor code worked during the Stalinism era. And when I say, for instance, well, you could never quit your job. If you were working in a factory, you could never quit unless you were allowed by your boss. And that was served them in a way. And people are not aware of that. If you were late for work, you could go to prison. And you were completely tied to these plants, these factories, places of work, which is naturally was never made official. It was a practice that was a complete contradiction to any constitutional norms. Like, well, everybody knew about these. And 16 million people from 1940s to 1956 were convicted for this type of like criminal offenses, so to say. A huge amount of people, undoubtedly. So, right, we have very distorted perception of the way people used to live during the era. Irina, thank you so much. And Yevgeny is raising his hand, I think. He's... Irina, yes, okay. Yevgeny, please go ahead. The very last question. Yes, very last question. Oleg, thank you so much for your presentation. It was incredibly interesting. I have a question. I think the issue that we might be facing in terms of, like when we talk about a great terror, I think we need to articulate some concepts. During the Revolutionary Wars, terror did not would position itself as terror, and lists of those that were shot would be printed. It was honest terror. It was frank terror. It termed itself terror. The Stalinist practices was a completely different representation of violence. The relatives would never know for 10 or 15 years that people were, for instance, were sentenced to death. And this terror would never present itself as terror. This problem of representation of violence, the difference between military communism and Stalinist purges, discourse-wise, there was a huge difference. And these languages of self-description and self-nomination, how would you resolve this? Terror that does not name itself terror. Terror that does not reveal itself, essentially. Oleg, I understood what you're talking about. This is a widespread issue. The difference between the so-called revolutionary Bolshevism that was on the rise and the declining dictatorship and terror that ensued, and this would you would see that across the board in the culture sphere or. They would start off with experiments and then go on to extreme conservatism. What you talked about just now, it's true and not true in a way. What was happening through those years would be termed a revolutionary terror, of course, and in a way it was open and frank. Remember these Moscow litigations, for instance, that were widely talked about, and similar proceedings would take in the region, but a lot was concealed, of course. Millions of people that were convicted, and these would be tacit. These proceedings would be secret. In this way, this type of terror wasn't open. I do think that we can still use the term, the Great Terror, although we know that these were like planned, ordered campaigns, quotas for people shot, etc. But well, this term, I think, is very understandable. It's a way to pinpoint the essence. I think, even though that it might not be scientifically the most precise one, I still think that we should continue to use it. That's the way I would put it. That's Irina, on this optimistic note, I guess we're ready to complete the discussion on the second presentation. Thank you very much.